Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. With me on the panel to my left, Emily Thornberry, Labour's Shadow Attorney General and MP for Islington South and Finsbury. Bim Afolami to my, I was going to say far right, but you're not really far right, are you, Bim? Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. And next to his left, and basically to everybody's left, is Ash Sarkar, Senior Editor at Novara Media. I was watching her on television earlier. She's gone back to her lefty days. Last time Ash was on, I thought, she's become more moderate. We'll see what she's like.
I thought I was going to be a homeowner, and then that fell through, so I've decided not to moderate
that's
myself
understandable.
anymore.
And also to my left, Lord Darroch, Kim Darroch, former British Ambassador to the United States, former UK Permanent Representative to the European Union, and former National Security Advisor to the British Government. So there are lots of things that you might want to phone in on tonight. I think we should probably have a question on Ukraine, shouldn't we? Kate Forbes, but many other things you might like to ask our panel about as well. The number to call 0345 6060 973. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's Delroy in Brixton. Hello, Delroy.
Hello, good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel.
And what's your question?
My question is this. Kate Forbes has every right to her own religious beliefs, but should she bring these beliefs into politics?
Emily.
Well, no. I think she can believe whatever she wants, and so long as she keeps those matters to herself, that's fine.
Why should she?
Well, because she shouldn't be imposing her views on other people. I mean, if she doesn't want to have an abortion, then she shouldn't have an abortion. But she shouldn't stop me having an abortion. If she doesn't think, if she was gay and she didn't think that she should sleep with anyone or fall in love with anyone or marry anyone, then that's a matter for her. But she shouldn't try and stop other people. Your own personal views should not, in those circumstances, be trying to impose on others. I think that people should be allowed to live their own lives, and that goes to her. If she wants to be, if these are the things she wants to believe, then let her believe them. But don't let her impose those beliefs on other people.
I think she would argue that she's not trying to impose those beliefs. She was asked a question and she gave a straight answer.
And the difficulty is where does this end? So if she was to be leader of Scotland, then if decisions came up, then she would allow her conscience to lead what she says is her conscience to lead her when it comes to making decisions, and that would then mean that she feels that she doesn't keep those matters to herself, but that they will inform her politics, and she will then. I know many people whose private views are one thing, but who appreciate that as a public figure, they have a duty to allow others to make their own decisions.
But if you look at it from the point of view that people complain that politicians don't give straight answers, then that surely puts another perspective on it, that I would rather have, if I was going to vote for a particular party and their leader held views like this, I'd quite like to know about that. It might not prevent me from voting for them, but I'd just quite like to know what their real views are.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, my view is I would never have an abortion because I think that is wrong, but I will allow other people to make their own decisions about what they think is right and wrong.
And that's what she said, isn't it?
Well, I don't think that is what she said, and I think that's the problem. That she has said that she is opposed to gay marriage being introduced into law. That's wrong. I mean, I don't think that she should be imposing those views. When
you stood for the leadership of the Labour Party, were there views that you felt you had to caveat because you thought, well, if I say that, I'm done for?
No.
Okay. Because you're fairly straightforward, aren't you?
I'm pretty straightforward, yeah.
Bim.
Well, I think she's perfectly entitled to have her views, and I agree with you, Iain, that it's so refreshing to have a politician who just says what they think in answer to a question. And she was asked her views about her religious beliefs and she explained them. And I think it's good that people know what her views are on those subjects. As Emily says, obviously all of our personal views, religious, ideological or otherwise, impact on the political decisions that you make, particularly in a leadership position. So I think that's good. I think, however, what this issue really shows is that she is really presenting what you might conventionally described as a sort of centre-right platform for a party that is actually really on the left. And the thing holding together this party is the quest for independence. And I think the ideological incoherence of the SNP is now being laid bare before the public because the route to independence at the moment doesn't appear to be profitable. And I think that is the real story here. It's that there are a group of activists who, on listening to her views, are now thinking, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm in the same party as this person. And the truth is that they only really have one thing in common. And I think that incoherence is why this is so damaging for the SNP, very damaging for her leadership prospects. And I think that, as the weeks and months to come, we'll see that the SNP really could be in the beginning of a downward spiral.
Have you ever had to caveat any of your real views, maybe when you were selected as an MP?
No.
Because I did, when I went for selection, there was one issue where I told a lie, and I've forever been ashamed of that. And I was asked they said, you're friends with Anne Widdecombe, do you share her views on hunting? And of course, she's very against hunting. And this was in North Norfolk, a very hunting area. And I said, just because she's my friend, I don't always share her views, which wasn't actually an outright lie. But I wasn't in favour of hunting, but had to pretend that I was. And I've always been ashamed of that.
No, I haven't, because I was lucky that when I went up for selection in Hitchin and Harpenden, broadly speaking, the reason why I was selected is because my members broadly agree with me on most things. So,
Ash.
I think as a general rule, you should never trust a politician when they say they're always honest, because let's face it, all of us moderate, caveat, say things we don't quite mean according to the audience that we're in. One of the things that I've certainly tried to do is be self-critical when I've done that and push for honesty in what I say and what I write. But sometimes that's a fight. It's a fight with myself and being scared of what the response is going to be. I think everybody does that. When it comes to Kate Forbes, though, I'm glad we live in a democracy where people can hold all sorts of minority opinions, even when I really vehemently disagree with them. And the good thing here is that she's participating in a democratic process where her views are being met with an electorate, well, it's electorate in terms of the SNP membership, and they're free to reject them and say, no, we don't trust you to protect minority rights. We think, sure, run for First Minister, but maybe in the 17th century where your views belong. And maybe you're in the wrong party. The SNP is broadly progressive on lots of social issues. I'd also say that the political common sense in Scotland tends to be more progressive on lots of other social issues. So she seems to be... I
think Douglas Ross, the Tory leader, yesterday said, she wouldn't be elected leader of the Tory party with these views.
Well, exactly. We're talking about being against gay marriage, against abortion, and against children being born out of wedlock. I mean, by the time of, the Chatterley ban coming to an end, people were thinking this is a little bit regressive. So I think that she's a politician who's in the wrong time and wrong place. Do you
think, though, that the sort of the liberal elites in politics and the media tend to think these views are fairly abhorrent? But out there among SNP members, I suspect that there might be a lot more sympathy for them.
I think most people have a kind of live and let live attitude. So you might have a privately held belief about something, but most people, I think, are fairly reticent to impose that on others, particularly when it comes to things like marriage and in what circumstances do you have children and whether or not you choose to have an abortion. And I think that where people bristle is when they feel that something is being imposed on them from the top down. So I don't think that necessarily that the SNP membership is going to be particularly hostile towards gay marriage.
I can't speak for the SNP membership, but what I can say is this illustrates how we've moved almost to a post-Christian society. These views are views that you would find a lot of people, not all, who go to church regularly, who are strong Christians, hold. And I think her sort of mistake, to the extent that she's made one, is not realising the extent to which modern Scottish opinion and maybe modern British opinion is significantly more liberal on these matters than the traditional Christian teaching is.
Kim Darroch.
Very
I knew
briefly,
you were looking forward to answering
I
this.
thought, I thought I might take a pass on this one, but since you've asked, look, I profoundly disagree with the views she's expressed. I think it's a good thing that she was asked the question and she answered it honestly. I had no idea that this is what she thought about these issues. And, Bim says, greatly damaged. I would have thought it's sort of written off her leadership campaign, although I do think there is more of a constituency for these views than some of us metropolitan Londoners might realise out there. But I think in terms of her now becoming SNP leader, I just can't imagine how that can happen. And I just wonder how she might have found herself all those years in the SNP talking to her colleagues and seeing policies passed that were much, much more liberal than she appears to believe.
Can I just take issue with this idea that the Scottish Nationalists are a socially are a progressive party? Because she was in charge of the money in Scotland and actually was really not just socially conservative, but economically conservative as well. And if you look at the cuts that have been imposed on local government in Scotland, it's quite clear that actually she comes from a different, is not the sort of progressive that Ash talks about. I mean, the incoherence in the Scottish Nationalists is, I do think it's right, is pulled together by the one belief, which is let's keep moving forward on independence for Scotland and, let's bury everything else. And when it comes to actually having a coherent view about what to do about the NHS or the cost of living, and this isn't what they want to debate. What they want to continue to debate, even within the leadership, is they want to continue to debate what do we think about independence, how are we going to go about that. That is, this is what pulls them together.
That is true, but you can still be progressive and fiscally prudent, can't you?
You can be socially.
Presumably that's what a Labour government would aspire to be.
Well, I think that there is I personally don't think that there's a great deal of difference between Kate Forbes and Margaret Thatcher's attitude to economics. I think that she's just a very, very conservative when it comes to economics, and is it in that wing, just as her social conservatism is at the far end. And as I say, she's been central to the Scottish Nationalist project recently.
Right, let's, Darroch, thank you for that. Let's move on to another question. Ben's in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Ian. Good evening, panel, as well. When is Rishi Sunak going to stand up to the ERG and the far right of his party as regards the Northern Irish Protocol?
Yes, Bim, when is he going to stand up to them?
Oh, I thought that was one for Emily.
Oh, she'll get her turn.
Well, I mean, look, the Conservative Party is a broad church. We're proud of that. There are the people who are negotiating this within government, Chris Heaton-Harris and Steve Baker, who, for those who don't know, are very strong Brexiteers, very long history and very trusted within that group, within the party. And they are the people at the forefront of negotiating this. And what I would say, and I'm not particularly in this wing, but I have a lot of friends who are, and I say to them, if it's good enough for Chris Heaton-Harris, it should be good enough for you.
But the question is, why doesn't he stand up to the ERG? Because if you look at the numbers, the percentage of Tory MPs that belong to the ERG, it's not that many, is it? Why is it the tail still wagging the dog?
I don't think that's right, actually. I think what's happening on discussions with colleagues earlier, because I was asking a few people what was going on, because I haven't really been central to this at all myself, is that actually most of the discussions are with the DUP, actually. And it is really important that we try and keep on side and bring on side the Northern Irish MPs.
But Jeffrey Donaldson, their leader, was actually at the ERG meeting this afternoon. I don't know whether he was trying to inject some backbone into the ERG or the other way round, but it's still the tail wagging the dog, isn't it?
Well, look, if you're doing something as big as this with the European Union, a big part of unfinished business, one might say, from Brexit, it's important that we try and get the whole party together and get the support of Northern Irish MPs.
You're never going to do it, though, are you? I mean, you're never going to do it. I mean, is it right that Suella Braverman's on being watched to see whether or not she's going to resign? That's what said in the Evening Standard, was that she was on the resignation watch.
It must be true.
I'm just saying, that she's from that wing. She's been given that job because she's supposed to shore up that wing. She's supposed to be their great flag bearer. So he might lose a Home Secretary. He might lose them. There's a Health Minister tonight saying, rigorously saying that she wasn't going to make up her mind yet, and she needed to see what was going to come out of this agreement as to. Maria Caulfield. Yeah. I think she was saying that she was going to wait and see what happened, and when asked about whether she was going to resign or not, and she was saying, I certainly hope that it'll work, and so on. Of course, she resigned previously. I mean, we do feel as though I don't know, it's Groundhog Day. You know, the Tories are fighting over Brexit and we're not getting anywhere, and the country's economy is being undermined, and the future of Northern Ireland is yet again being undermined, and the Tories, spend their time negotiating with one another instead of looking at what's good for the country. And if they come back with a deal, if Rishi Sunak came back with a deal that was good for the country, he doesn't actually need to negotiate with the Tories, just like Theresa May didn't need to negotiate with the Tories. And she had a deal that was good for the country, we would have voted for it, just like if Rishi Sunak has a deal that was good for the country, we'll support. But, we're just like...
Because I know the Labour
it's
front
all
bench
just
has the Prime Minister's, interests.
Well, actually, the country's interests at heart. I mean, just not being sort of quite as... Well, yes, actually, yes.
Well, I think Keir Starmer's already said that you would support any deal that Rishi Sunak did.
Well, so long as it's one that's good for the country, that's what we will do. And to be quite honest, we need to move on from this. Northern Ireland needs to move on from this. There's a great deal, that needs to be negotiated in relation to Brexit in order to kind of look after our country's interests. And it's being completely held up at the moment by us not being able to move on in relation to Northern Ireland. We need to get that sorted. We have a great deal else on the agenda. I mean, remember, this Brexit deal was agreed on Christmas Eve. It wasn't a full agreement. There is still much more that needs to be done, but nothing can be done at the moment because we're still stuck on Northern Ireland and we're still stuck with these backbench Tories holding the whole country to ransom.
I don't know if Rishi Sunak is going to cave in to the ERG. I hope he isn't. But I did 15 years of my career on EU business, and one thing I am certain of is this is as good a deal, pretty much, as you're going to get on this. And if the ERG think there is some better magic deal out there, then they are being completely delusional. And if they succeed in turning this around and blocking it somehow, then it means no improvement on the ground in Northern Ireland. It means we don't rejoin Horizon, which is enormously important to British universities. It means we don't unfreeze relations with the US. And it means we won't have the opportunity to do more deals with the EU to free up trade and travel. So it would be very, very bad in the UK national interest if it does get blocked. I applaud what Sunak has done in getting it to this point. And I just hope he can get it through because we need it, and we need to move on from the Northern Ireland Protocol to the other issues to correct what I have to say was a disastrous original Brexit deal.
You were in Washington throughout some of the period that all of this was going on. Obviously, a different administration at that point. But some people in this country scratch their heads as to why the US is so invested in the Northern Ireland Protocol. Just explain why that is.
There was a big US involvement. I mean, let's be straight about this. This was Tony Blair's achievement and his team, and John Major contributed a lot in the early years to it. But people like John Mitchell, George Mitchell, who's a senior US Democrat, and the Northern Ireland Friendship Group in the US Congress believe they contributed to the Northern Ireland Agreement, to the Good Friday Agreement, and they feel they share ownership of it. Yeah. And they are determined
and they're one of the
to see it preserved. And they're one of the guarantors to it. And look, Biden himself has strong Irish roots. He often describes himself as an Irishman. And he is always been interested in this. Always been interested in this. And he's heavily influenced by the Irish Friendship Group in Congress. And so they're not going to move on this. And by the way, this has been clear from before Biden won the election. The Democrats were saying this back in 2018, 2019. Nancy Pelosi came over while I was still there and issued warnings about all of this, before that election. So we've known this for a long, long time.
Ash?
I think you're all being very nice and treating the ERG like they're acting in good faith here, and they're really worried about the technical details of the Northern Ireland Protocol. The fact is that when Boris Johnson brought this deal back to his MPs, his party in the country, no one seemed to have a real problem with this bit, apart from the DUP, who obviously raised their concerns. And Boris Johnson said, I'm going to try and say this in a more Ofcom friendly way than it's playing in my head, but
Please do.
Go
We've been here before with
shall
Ash.
we say? He sort of told them where to go, right? His political priorities were different. He went to the country, he said it's an oven-ready deal, right? This is it, no quibbling, right? Job's done. And now, after the agreement has been signed by both sides, the Conservative Party are going, oh no, we want to reopen it. Now, regardless of the rights or wrongs of that, one, that's an incredibly weak negotiating position, right? You've both signed it already, and now you want to open it up. Two, you're expecting the EU to move, and they're going to be demanding some concessions. I don't know what that's going to be, but they certainly will. And three, Rishi Sunak is hoping that this is going to put, his mutinous backbenchers to bed, but he's a structurally weak prime minister. He's the backup plan. He's nobody's first choice of prom date. And these MPs are going to find another pretext, I think, to try and destabilise them later down the line. It's just going to be something else.
Ben, we're going to have to end that here because we're very late to go to. I know I'd happily do it for much longer.
I've got my popcorn out.
Maybe we'll continue it after the break. It's 8:20.
This is LBC.
On the cross-question panel, Lord Kim Darroch, Emily Thornberry, Bim Afolami and Ash Sarkar. Let's go to our next question. It's from Chris in Stockport. Hello, Chris. Oh, it's a text question. How alarmed should we be about Putin pulling Russia out of a nuclear weapons treaty? Now, imagine, Kim, you're in your former role as National Security Advisor, and I'm the Prime Minister. What's your advice?
This is the last of those agreements, those big arms control agreements. We all remember START and SALT and those deals back in the 80s. And this one, I think, was signed in 2010 and was rolled over again in 2020 or 2021. And it's the last one that is out there, really. And look, it's a bad thing that the Russians have pulled out of it. And life is dangerous enough already. Things are fragile enough already. So I'm not going to say it's massively improved or worse than that fragility. I think it's pretty bad anyway. And there are bigger risks to global security, bigger risks of triggering a Russia-NATO war than this. but it's a bad thing. And it was one of those things, one of those bits of structure for East-West relations that has now gone. If you want to look at a little bit of the other side of the argument, the Americans thought the Russians were cheating on the deal anyway, and so had raised this with the Russians and might have withdrawn anyway. So the thing might have crashed in the next 12 months anyway. And it was one of the few things that Putin could do, one of the few things left in terms of sort of US Russia structure that he could pull out of. So it was maybe an obvious thing for him to pick for this speech. So it's bad, but I mean, plenty of other things that keep you awake at night before this.
But from a propaganda point of view, maybe it would have been better for him to wait and for the Americans to be seen as the bad guys.
Maybe plus the audience amongst developing countries out there like the existence of deals that keep a lid on nuclear weapons between East and West. And so Russia pulling out of this one, not the Americans pulling out of it, won't help their case with developing world. Not that will have been at the forefront of Putin's mind.
Bim?
I think we should be pretty worried because it is another layer of legality and international agreement that Putin is pulling away. He's pulled away at a lot of that already through the invasion and how he's conducted himself. And what the international community needs to think about, in addition to supporting Ukraine, is how do we somehow constrain Russia legally through the international system in a way that they can trust so that ultimately they will stay within it. Because if Russia completely is outside any sort of treaty, any sort of agreement, any sort of legal framework, then that means that going into the future, the risk of nuclear escalation is greater, not less.
Ash?
This seems to me to be a bit of... it goes along with what Putin's been doing, is trying to raise the stakes of the cost of him losing, which is the worse that I do, the more territory that I lose, the more Russian lives that are lost. I'm going to try and raise the stakes of some kind of nuclear confrontation, or raise the spectre of using tactical nukes, for instance. It's very clear that this is a war which is not going the way in which he expected. His experience of invasions before this were that they were very quick, made territory gains very fast, and there weren't huge international repercussions for the invasion of Crimea or of Georgia, not really. So I think that to a certain degree, this is a bit of saber rattling. The thing that I'll say, and this is one of the aspects of the conflict which worries me deeply, is what does the space for a negotiated settlement look like? I know that people are talking about the defeat of Putin in Ukraine, the restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity, but short of either, Zelensky marching into Moscow or Putin and his military leadership spontaneously combusting, there will have to be some kind of negotiated settlement at that point. I understand that might not be strategic to talk about what that would look like now, but isn't that ultimately where
Would you accept that is really essentially, and maybe Ken will have a view on this, that has to be the Ukrainians that make that decision?
Well, absolutely it does. But there was that Naftali Bennett interview which came out, I think, earlier this month. And one of the things that he says, this is the former Israeli Prime Minister, is that a month into the invasion, there seemed maybe a 50-50 chance of striking some kind of agreement with significant concessions being made on both sides. Zelensky drops NATO membership, Putin drops the demand of regime change. And the allegation that Bennett makes is that Boris Johnson essentially intervened and said, no, press the Russians, they're a lot weaker than we thought they were, and in effect prolonged the conflict. So one of the things that worries me about the nature of the conversation that we have here in the UK is that there doesn't seem to be a great degree of honesty about whether or not there is a sort of strategic decision being made to prolong the conflict, bleed Russia out, because they think it will weaken Putin and advance Western interests.
Emily?
No, I think that's wrong. I think the reason that it's really important that we remain completely united in our support of Ukraine is because after Ukraine, where next? I think that unless Ukraine wins, and Ukraine does need to win, I think that Putin has been quite clear that his agenda is to go elsewhere, is to recapture territory which he believes is Russian by right. And there are many countries on the border of Russia who are genuinely and rightly concerned, worried, frightened, terrified what Putin will do next if he does win in Ukraine. And it really is very important for the West to stand united, as we are, and as we've seen today. Who would have thought that you'd end up seeing the American president turning up in a war zone? Extraordinary. Or you'd see, Keir Starmer going off and meeting the president, and it being made completely clear that whichever government there is in the UK, we will stand united in support of Ukraine and giving it all
But when
support.
Boris Johnson went there, you described it as, or Labour described it as a stunt.
Which time?
Well, he's been there several times.
Exactly. And it's not a stunt. It's not a stunt.
You can't have it both ways, though.
No.
If Keir Starmer goes, it's fine, but if Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak goes, it isn't.
No, honestly, Iain. The important message is to make it clear that whoever is the government in Britain, the policy remains the same. And that has been, quite clearly demonstrated by Keir going to Kiev and making that commitment. That is not a stunt. That's just making
No, I
clear what
agree.
British
I think he
politics
should have
are.
gone. That's absolutely right.
I was always struck by when it was that Boris Johnson would pop up in Ukraine, and you could possibly look at the difficulties he was having at home and how that seemed to coincide with when he arrived. But I don't want to be ungenerous, because his commitment to Ukraine was clear and was genuine. It was just sometimes the timing looked to be quite cynical.
Right, we'll move on. More questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel over the next half an hour. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:31 and here's Charlotte Morgan with the news headlines.
More than 1 million public sector workers, including police officers and NHS staff, could see their pay increase by 3.5%. Government departments have submitted what they think is a reasonable rise for the next financial year. It's being described as pitiful by Unison. In a speech in Poland, President Biden says Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia ahead of the first anniversary of the war. Earlier, Vladimir Putin used his State of the Nation address to blame the West for the conflict. And Kate Forbes says she's still in the race to be Scotland's next First Minister. She's caused controversy over some of her religious beliefs, including saying it's wrong to have children outside marriage. LBC weather: rain in the northwest tonight, drier elsewhere with a low of 4 Celsius.
This is LBC.
How much
Over on LBC, I've just had to break up a discussion on which their favourite medieval king is. There's a bit of dissension on the panel on that one. But we have with us Emily Thornberry, Kim Darroch, Bim Afolami and Ash Sarkar. Let's go to another question from Frankie in Camberwell, who says he's often ridiculed because of his age and the gaffes, but has taking on Putin today been the making of Joe Biden on the global stage? Ash Sarkar.
Well, I think that this is one of the most significant bits of foreign policy Joe Biden has been involved with. He's focused on domestic issues, and you can understand why, following on from Trump. And I think that he certainly appeared statesmanlike. In terms of whether or not this is going to be the only thing that he's remembered for at the end of his presidency, I think too soon to tell. But no, I think that he did certainly look impressive.
But he's, to coin a phrase, had a good war, hasn't he? I mean, he has shown leadership over Ukraine.
I think that
in a way that Obama didn't over one or two conflicts with Putin.
Well, I think when it comes to the lead up to this horrific war of aggression waged by Putin, you could say that there was complacency from all Western leaders. Even after the 2014 invasion, Russia holds the World Cup, is allowed to, participate in one of the biggest acts of sports washing the world has ever seen. Russian money is sloshing around the Conservative Party. You've got Russian oligarchs buying up half of Mayfair. We were astonishingly casual about these things until it was too late.
Kim Darroch.
Biden's first term has been, maybe his only term, but it's been more consequential than a lot of people expected of him, given his record. I mean, he tried twice for the presidency when younger and fell out early both times. So people didn't have great expectations. He got through, I think, 3 big spending bills, total something like $4.5 trillion on recovery from the pandemic, on health, on green policies, and on infrastructure. And that's already one of the biggest spending programs any president's passed in recent years. On the flip side, there was that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I think you're right. I think he's had a good war. I think it was a smart move to call out Russia before they actually invaded, to alert the world about what was about to happen. And I think he's shown a reasonable, decent degree of leadership since. And so far, the West, NATO has held together better than some might have expected. So I think it's part of why he is now looking determined to run again in 2024. And if he were to win in 2024, he would then be president from the age of 82 to 86, which I think is the oldest American president ever. But let's just remember, foreign policy triumphs don't deliver election victories. At least they don't in America. George Bush the Elder had a total triumph in the first war against the Iraqis when they invaded Kuwait and lost the election to Bill Clinton a few months later. So whether this translates into electoral success for Joe Biden is another question. But I think he's done better in his first term, including on this, than most people expected.
Emily?
I think also people shouldn't forget that Joe Biden had been in politics for a very long time. So he understood how to get bills through in a way that previous presidents didn't. I mean, obviously Trump didn't, but previous presidents as well. So if legislation needed to get through, he knew how to do it and how to navigate it through. So I think that experience was really important. And I think also his international experience was really important before becoming president. I mean, to be honest, everybody had met him. I mean, I'd met him. Everybody had met him. Biden kind of went around and, and he'd been involved.
What impression did you have of him when you met him?
I thought he was fun, and he said that, what did he say? He said, Labour, hey, if I was British, Labour would be my party. And I said, yes.
It's not what he said to me.
Go on, Bim.
Look, I broadly agree with what both Emily and Kim said, just on the domestic front. Because ultimately that's what wins people elections. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act, which is an act they recently passed, which is mostly a climate and green policy bill, though they called it the Inflation Reduction Act so they could get it through, is a really significant piece of legislation that, I was in Washington last week, spoke to a lot of people about it. Ultimately, it's a protectionist piece of legislation. It is seeking to incentivize and use huge amounts of US federal power to get investment in the US and to prioritize American businesses.
In the way that Trump talked about it,
And never
but
did
didn't ever did anything.
And I think that alone is a really significant piece of legislation. And just on what Emily said, I'm a relatively young politician still, I suppose, but I think experience really matters. And when you see someone who is experienced in the art of politics, it is important. And Obama was inspirational and intellectually brilliant in lots of ways, but he didn't have that level of experience. And I think that when you see somebody of his depth of experience, it actually means that you can actually get things done.
But you see, but of course, Obama had the intelligence to know that a really good deputy would be Biden. So that
but if you read his memoirs, he didn't rate Biden at all.
Yeah, well.
That's the interesting thing. Gordon in Hampstead says, but who is their favourite medieval king? You have to tell us now. Bim.
Charlemagne.
Oh, I thought we were only
doing
English
British ones.
Oh,
English.
Forgive me. Well, in that case, you have to go with Athelstan, though Tom Holland, the historian's has been very persuasive on that on his podcast.
See, this is the difference between a historian and an English lit student. I have to go with Richard II purely because it was under his reign that Chaucer was writing.
Well, there you go. Emily.
Eleanor of Aquitaine.
No, she's not English.
She produced kind of 3 English kings.
All right,
Hello.
that's true. Kim.
I did zoology at university. History in the O-level. I'm a Charles Darwin person.
Okay. Right, let's move on to a caller, Elizabeth in Windsor. It says brackets, don't make any jokes, so I won't. Elizabeth, very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Do you think the Conservative Democratic Organisation should be allowed to run a campaign to deselect Conservative MPs who wrote letters in the support of the removal of Boris Johnson?
And this is on Damien Green, who was not selected for a new seat in Kent earlier this week. Opinions vary as to who brought that about and what the reason was. But this new organisation, the Conservative Democratic Organisation, it's being funded by Peter Cruddas, Lord Cruddas, a Conservative Party donor, and they've become, well, quite noisy, Bim. Are you sort of fearing that you might follow the same route as Damien Green?
No, but I do know some of the people involved with the Conservative Democratic organisation, and I don't think that's what David Campbell Bannerman says is speaking for all of them. I'd say that, and he's the one who's been very noisy in the media.
Apparently your mic isn't working, so I'm going to move on to someone else while somebody will try and fix it. Emily.
I don't want to say anything about this. I think that I don't want to tread on Conservative Party grief. I mean, I do believe in party democracy. I do believe in members having a say. I think they are a really important part of our democratic process. And there's always a tension between allowing members to run their party and for members of parliament to have the freedom to behave in a way which they think is right. But I personally think you should always be answerable to your local members and to your conscience and to your constituents. And the balancing act between the three is a difficult job, but that's what being an MP is about.
I mean, do they strike you as a bit momentum-y?
No, I don't really know anything about them, to be honest. I wouldn't have thought they were terribly momentum-y, no.
Kim?
Yeah, I mean, this is a new story to me. Apologies for not having followed this bit of internal Conservative Party politics. I don't like the sound of it. And this doesn't seem to me, if the way it was presented in the question is accurate, it doesn't seem to me a fair way of treating some very good MPs, and I know Damien Green, and I've always liked him and rated him. I think the Conservative Party is at its best when it's quite a broad church with a good range of views inside it.
I mean, some of the people at that meeting said, well, we didn't get rid of him because he didn't support Boris Johnson. He's 64. We thought someone else should have a go. Ash?
I mean, this is why I believe in open selections, where you can contest the candidacy openly, because I think it encourages positive rather than negative campaigning, and it allows for new talent, fresh faces to come through and have the opportunity of, joining Parliament. Because I think that this sort of, shadowy manoeuvrings and stabs in the dark, it creates a really negative politics. And I think we all suffer for it, whether it's the Conservative Party or Labour or whoever else it might be.
Right, thank you very much for that.
How about hearing from Bim?
Oh, no, well, he got half an answer.
On,
right?
let's see what
on.
he has to say.
Go on, let's have another go.
Hear me? Right.
Hopefully. It's
not my understanding that that's why, as you said, Iain, I heard something similar. It is really important, though, that we retain experienced members of Parliament, and that people like Damien, who are really well respected and rated by everybody, stay within the parliamentary party. So I'm very sad that it happened, but I'm also confident that in the end, when it goes to full membership, he'll win.
Oh, I thought he was out already, but it doesn't get. He's
No,
not going
that's
to full
not how it
membership.
works. So he has the ability to go to the full members and say he wants to be.
Okay. Well, I learned something new. Thank you, Emily, for making me go back to BIM, because we learned something there. Right, we'll have another question in just a moment. It's 8:45.
This is LBC.
Business. Tuned in, Kim Darroch, Emily Thornberry, Bim Afolami and Ash Sarkar with us answering your questions. A text question from Brendan in Thurrock says, a load of companies seem to think a 4-day working week is a good idea. Is it viable or just luxury communism in action? Ash Sarkar, the world's most famous luxury communist.
You know what?
Self-declared.
I wish it was luxury communism. Instead, it's just good old-fashioned common sense. So Novara Media is a 4-day week organisation. One of the reasons that we implemented, if we can be bothered to turn up, we decided to go with a 4-day week because we decided that staff retention was more important to us. That what we wanted to do was have people grow with us as an organisation. We keep you for 5-10 years, and that meant not pushing people to the point of burnout. And unfortunately, burnout, stress epidemic, problems with mental health. That's something which you're seeing across the whole of the UK, and work is a really big part of it. So with the trial, which has just been done of 61 companies, the vast majority, I think it's definitely over 55 of them have decided to keep it. Many are reporting increases in their productivity and also less absenteeism, greater workplace satisfaction, so on and so forth. I'm not saying the same model of 4-day week is going to work everywhere. Some businesses are going to benefit more from what you'd call a 4-day year. So for more intense periods, you work 5 days, 6 days, maybe more. For periods of lower intensity, it's more like 3 or 4. But overall, you've got a greater amount of leisure time.
But it wouldn't work, for example, like in the health service, would it?
Well, I think that would be something that the NHS would have to look at. It's not something that I can say I'm an expert on. But job creation wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing in the public sector. So there's a report done by Autonomy which said, well, look, if you had a public sector 4-day week where you'd create jobs, in particular would be Red Wall seats and in Wales, so places which really do need job creation. So I'm not saying that is something which will work absolutely everywhere or work everywhere in the same way, but this is a really encouraging pilot, and I think it will perhaps prompt more businesses to give it a go.
Well, if you have a view on this, we're going to be talking about it for an hour after 9, because I think it's a fascinating subject, actually, as to whether a 4-day working week can work. This new pilot scheme demonstrates that for many companies it can. Bim, what's your view?
Well, I think a free market is one that allows companies to run their companies and run themselves in the way that they wish. And if they feel that this is something they want to do, then they should be allowed to do it. And the proof of the pudding will be in their results and their retention and how they actually do producing their product or service, whatever they do. So I don't think it's up to politicians to say you shouldn't do it. I am doubtful whether in many areas this is actually likely to increase the productivity of a business overall after a period of time, once the initial sugar rush has sort of died down. But companies are entitled in a free market to do what they want in order to gain advantage over competition.
Sector? Because
in the public sector,
I don't know whether this pilot covered the public sector. I don't think it did, but I mean, there will be some public sector organisations where it could work and others where it couldn't, I would have thought.
I'm afraid I think in most areas of the public sector, if not all, it's pretty much impossible to do that.
Local government?
Well, frankly, I think a lot of it's in 4-day week anyway. I mean, I feel that
that's going to go viral.
I feel that a lot of you cannot, if you are using taxpayers' money, the emphasis needs to be on making sure you provide the most amount of service at all times. And frankly, that's 7 days a week in many areas across the public sector. Obviously not the same person for all 7 days, but the idea that we're now going to find another 20% or 15% of staff to cover for an extra day off, I think is unlikely.
Emily?
I'm going to do my best not to rise to that, but I do think it's encouraging. It's good news, and it may well be that other companies will want to do it. I do think we have to be careful about not trying to run before we can walk. I think there is a great deal else that needs to be done. So you're giving people the right to flexible working, giving people proper pay, getting rid of 0-hours contracts, ensuring that people get ending fire and rehire, and all the things that we have in our New Deal for working people will be things that we will do if we are given the opportunity to serve and able to change the law. We will bring in these rights. And I think that will make a great deal of difference. But if in the meantime companies find that their workers actually are as productive under 4 days as they were in 5 days, then great, then let them do it. But I think that we need to underpin our working legislation and rules, and we need to be changing them much more and bringing them into the 21st century.
Kim?
Briefly, I would have been a sceptic about it until I read this report, but the headlines of what I read this morning are remarkable. I mean, it seems that 90% of the companies involved, 60-odd companies involved in this process, in this exercise, are going to carry on with it, either for a certain period of time or even permanently. That stress levels were down, absenteeism through illness was down, output was up in many cases, and productivity was up in a lot of cases. So it seems to have worked for a lot of the companies involved. So my scepticism probably isn't justified. Won't work for everyone, and I can't see how it would apply in parts of the private sector, like the NHS, for example, because you'd need a lot of extra workers to cover weekends or 3-day weekends or whatever. But it's right. Bim is right. If companies want to try it and in the private sector it works for them, let them do it.
Right, Brendan, thank you for that. Let's move on to our final question. It's from Julie in Liverpool, who says, is the UK still a country where if you commit a crime, you can expect to be punished for it? Now, I'm not sure what that is linked to. If there's a particular case in the news on that. I'm getting blank looks all around the panel.
Labour's got a crime week at the moment, and we're raising the issue as often as we can, because we are very concerned that there is... it seems to be clear that the rates of crime are going up, and the rates of detection are going down, and the number of cases actually coming to court is going down, and the amount of time that people have to wait in order to have their case heard in court, if they are caught, if they are brought to court, the amount of time they then have to wait in order for a case to be resolved is extending all the time. So we have a criminal justice system which is completely in chaos and in a huge amount of crisis, and that's why for this whole week we've been talking about crime and pointing it out. And I'm afraid there are some crimes where people can expect not to be caught, and that is a terrible place to be, and it's getting worse.
Kim?
I do think there are big problems in the criminal justice system, and I think in particular that the extraordinarily low rates of detection are something that should worry all of us, and about which governments should do something. Yeah. I'm afraid I don't know what that thing is. Can't be just a question of throwing money at it and more people at it. I mean, I think numbers of police have increased in recent years, and it's not produced any change, I think, any improvement in detection rates. So there is something about how the police forces are organised, how they do their work, what their priorities are, that needs to be looked at.
Bim?
The thing that in particular I worry about is just the epidemic in online crime. I think you're more likely to suffer from a crime online than you are in person, so to speak. And that is an area where the police really struggle skill-wise just to keep up with these fraudsters, often international, online. And that is one area where we really need to invest as a society, as a government, and say, how do we improve the detection of crimes online? Because it's everybody knows somebody who's been subject of a scam or something, and it's very, very difficult.
But I've asked the government, and the government can't even tell us what the extent of crime and how much money we lose as a country as a result of fraud. They can't even tell us what proportion of fraud comes from the UK and what proportion comes from outside, it seems to me. And we remember we did have, Kwasi Kwarteng said that fraud wasn't something which affected ordinary people, and clearly it does. And you're absolutely right. Well, this is the 21st century crime. Well, and it's the 21st century crime, and we don't have a 21st century answer to it.
Ash?
I mean, I think that the criminal justice system is one part of the picture when you want to talk about bringing down crime. And the fact is that people at the moment feel very unsafe. If you're burgled, you only call the police, you can get the crime reference number for your insurance. You don't expect them to be caught. And I live in an area of North London where a lot of the violent crime is linked to deprivation, inequality, and also cuts to services like Sure Start and social services.
How do those cuts make violent crime?
Well, because one is that you've got a lot of vulnerable people, so kids who are known as looked after children, they're subject to a child protection plan. Cuts to social services mean that the contact that they're getting with the state to make sure that they're being looked after, that's going down. The ability of social services to intervene and do things like, say, help a family move house when they're being targeted by a gang, that ability has been decimated, and that's something which is very much related to violent youth crime. So I think you have to look at the whole picture and look at what's needed for prevention as well as deterrence.
Right, let's go to a final caller for our fun question. It's Stephen, East Grinstead. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, good evening, Ian, and to your panel. Asda and Morrison's are limiting sales of some fruits and vegetables due to the growers' higher costs and weather-damaged produce. Which fruit or vegetable could the panel live without?
Quality question there. Bim?
Cauliflower, without.
Ash? Bitter gourd. Have you ever had it?
What on earth
is that? It's a Bangladeshi vegetable, which looks a bit like okra, and it's a Bangladeshi delicacy, and my mum made it for me. I thought it was okra. I took a big spoonful, and it tastes exactly like earwax.
Oh, no.
How do you know what earwax tastes like?
Yeah, that's what I was getting. No, let's not even ask. Emily?
Kale.
Yeah, I agree with you. Kim?
Easiest question of the night, Brussels sprouts.
I'm with you on that as well. In fact, I hate
Brussels sprouts with pancetta.
I hate cauliflower too. In fact, I hate all vegetables apart from peppers and onions, which is why I'm not a vegetarian. Simple as that. Right, we are going. Thank you to our panel, to Kim, Emily, Ash, and Bim. In a moment, we are going to turn our attention back to the 4-day working week, because nearly all companies taking part in a trial on the 4-day working week are opting to continue with new working patterns as staff report better work-life balances. Now, the vast majority of the companies taking part in the world's largest trial of a 4-day week have opted to continue with this new working pattern in a result hailed as evidence that it could work across the UK economy. Well, I want to ask you in this hour, how would it work in your line of work? Because I can see that in many companies, organisations, it could work. But what about people who work in organisations where it patently couldn't? What are they? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the head of the Royal College of Nursing says patients and staff can now breathe